Okay, so for this part of Unit 2, we are going to talk about Mesoamerican civilization down here, where the Aztec Empire reigned. And again, this right here, this other arrow on the right side of the page shows Haiti, and that's where Columbus first landed. Down here is where Cortes, the Spanish conquistador, landed, and the Aztec Empire was thriving quite beautifully in the early 1500s, early 16th century. So the focus question that we are going to be answering is, how was the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortes, along with a few hundred men, able to conquer the Aztec Empire of 25 million? In order to answer this question properly, you will need to discuss at least 6 main reasons. And in order to properly discuss those 6 main reasons, you will need to consult the assigned primary source documents, the PSDs for Unit 2, along with the textbook, Ways of the World, and lastly, lectures and PowerPoints, which should be used only if necessary. And in this case, you can find pretty much everything that you need to find in the primary source documents and in the textbook. You will need to cite your sources, and an outline for this is due for points, and this is a really good opportunity for a low point value to practice your best to learn how to create a good, thorough, argumentative outline for an essay. We're not going to be writing an essay, but the outline is pretty much the equivalent of an essay, so you should consider it as such. The Aztec Empire is located in modern-day Mexico. Down here in this map on the bottom, you can see the dark green is the Aztec Empire, and on this upper map you can see up here, I'm sorry it's a little fuzzy, the orange is Tenochtitlan, which is modern-day Mexico City, and that was the core heart, the central heartland of the Aztec Empire. And the peachy color surrounding it is the tributary states, groups, other states that had to pay tribute to the Aztec Empire, and in the form of foodstuffs and other tribute. And then the darkish color, purplish sort of, are allied states, those who were friends of the Aztec Empire. So, how did Cortes conquer the Aztecs? One, religious beliefs. And I put question marks around this because there is a lot of controversy depending on the sources. A few things that we know as fact: they were religious, God-fearing people. No one will dispute this. They actually had several gods, and the history and the culture goes back many generations to the Maya, who helped establish what is called the Popol Vuh, which is kind of like the Christian Bible, or other religious texts. And it shows how the world was created by corn and water out of the gods, and the gods sort of sacrificed themselves and took parts of them to create the people and the world. And therefore, in order to appease the gods so that the rain will fall properly and the corn will grow — corn is a hugely important part of Aztec culture, of Mesoamerican culture in general — in order to appease those gods, there was a need for human or blood sacrifice. For example, Huitzilopochtli was the war god, and he needed hearts. And so if people went to war, someone was going to be sacrificed at the end of the battle to provide hearts to this god. Other gods just desired blood, and a lot of times it came from nobility in the form of self bloodletting. Women would draw blood from their tongues, studded thorns through their tongues, and men through their penises, which sounds horrifying, and I would not personally want to participate in that, but it shows that it wasn't a violent religion meant to harm other people, but even the nobility, the Aztec kings and queens, would self-bloodlet to provide blood to the gods so that the gods would be appeased and their reigns would be continue to be powerful. Quetzalcoatl, the god of creation, also the god of brotherhood and kingship, meaning whoever is the king is a king because Quetzalcoatl allows him to be king. There was this belief that he was going to return in a human-like form around the year of 1519. The Aztec calendar is different, but it corresponded to the year 1519. And what's interesting about this is that we have this feathered serpent man god who is going to return to the Aztec people, and this is the same year and the same time that Cortes arrives in his ships with his tools and his uniforms that are so extravagant and so out of the ordinary for the Aztec people that the Aztecs, according to some interpretations, perhaps thought that Cortes was Quetzalcoatl, the god. And that led to a lot of challenges. So this is just an image from the Popol Vuh, and it shows the culture and the belief system that the people were made from corn and water, and the big people up there are the gods, and the little people down below are the mix of the corn and the water turning into humans. And these are images from the Florentine or Italian Aztec Codex. Now this was made by Italian friars, religious leaders who came to learn about the Aztec culture and in an attempt to convert the people. And these are images of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent man god, who provided the kingship with power and etc. Bernal Diaz is a man who traveled with Cortes, a religious leader, and he describes the human sacrifice and the bloodletting in the temples. And of course, from a European perspective, you see a live human being getting his heart ripped out, and that has to be one of the most horrifying things to ever experience, to ever see happening, to ever witness. And of course, the people whose hearts are being ripped out aren't like, yay, this is fun, sacrifice me to the gods. They're probably screaming in agony, this is not comfortable, to put it mildly. I hate you all, I want you all to die, of course. That's what I would be saying, at least. And of course, screaming in pain, because that cannot possibly feel good. Something important to realize, though, is that these images are created by Europeans, so they are European perspectives. However, they are very realistic depictions of what actually was happening in the Aztec courts, in the temples, because human and blood sacrifice was definitely a huge part of the Aztec culture. Okay, so second point, how did Cortes conquer the Aztecs? Well, part of that was the Aztec warring strategies. The Aztec Empire was founded in 1325, and they were considered foreigners in former Mayan territory. They had many enemies, and they were considered a warring people. They had many enemies because they had 35 tribute-based states centered at Tenochtitlan, which was that map that we looked at in the beginning here. And there were very strict social hierarchies, starting with the king and moving down to the tribute-based states who paid tribute by force. If they didn't, you did not want to mess with the Aztecs. They were more strong, had better resources, etc. And what's interesting about their warfare is that it was ritualized. They captured people for future sacrifice. And again, this was to appease the gods. They needed blood, they needed hearts. And so their warfare wasn't just to throw spears from far, it was to physically capture people and take them back home for use later on. And when you think about how this compares to Cortes, who comes to conquer, he does not want to capture anybody. He wants to kill as many people as possible. This is again an image for one of the codexes created by Europeans, and it just shows the Aztecs were definitely a warring people. They were trained in warfare. They had their weaponry and their shields and their, I want to call them costumes, no, uniforms, war uniforms, with animal prints and feathers, and all of this was very important for ritual, for warfare ritual. Another point is the Aztec capital. Tenochtitlan is an incredible city floating on water. And you can kind of see in this image down here that there are crop gardens and everything is floating. In order to get from one part of the city to the next, you needed to row there in canoes, which is just an incredible feat of engineering at this time. But if you think about it, how hard would it be to cut off some bridges to prevent people from walking across? That would prevent people from gaining access to things like fresh water, and that becomes a problem when we have things like smallpox epidemics. Just another map of the floating island Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan. And the leader, his name is Moctezuma II, also known as Montezuma. And he ruled from 1502 till 1520 until Cortes formally took over. And he was a decent leader for the most part, but he wavered in his beliefs. He wavered in his understanding of who Cortes was and his role. Was he the god Quetzalcoatl? Was he just a person who was coming to take over? He came with those weird ships in the weird uniforms with things like steel swords and horses and other weapons that had never been used before, firepower, for example. And this really scared not just the people, but the leader himself. And when your leader is scared and unsure of what to do, how to react, and what to think of the enemy, that creates instability in the whole community. I love this image. It's from like a little kiddie book, sort of like maybe a high school or middle school book, but I love it because it shows in kind of great detail some of the amazing things that were found here. There were the temples up top for the rain and sun gods. You could find gold, silver, and stones, precious stones. Bernal Diaz, the guy who accompanied Cortes, compares Tenochtitlan to Istanbul and Roman markets, and it was as huge as London, or excuse me, 5 times bigger than London. These are really interesting statistics, interesting facts, because the things that you were to find here were equivalent or greater than some of the European and Middle Eastern and African treasures. And again, there are canals to the city regions. You could get from place to place via canoe and some bridges. But when those bridges are cut off, that is a really big challenge. And floating crop gardens. It is also said that there were things like exotic zoos with animals that were very, very interesting and unusual, at least for the majority of people to see. And here's an image of the conquistador from Spain, Hernan Cortes, and he landed on the eastern side of what is now Mexico and named the area Veracruz. And another means of him conquering, his ability to conquer the Aztecs, the humongous Aztec Empire, was his ability to know his enemy, to understand who the Aztecs were. He ended up meeting a few people. Aguilar, who was a Spanish Franciscan priest, he had been shipwrecked years prior and had learned Mayan, learned the language, and understood the culture and the people. So he was a really good interpreter for Cortes at first. And the native Aztecs gave him a woman named Doña Marina, who is also known as La Milanche, and she became his translator. She was Mayan and had been sort of taken by the Aztecs to be used as a slave, so she didn't really have allegiance to the Aztec people, and we can't think of people who were natives to the Mesoamerican region as allied with each other, because kind of like today, even though Europe is all part of Europe, there are, and have been in the last century, extraordinary battles between nations. So same in the Mesoamerican region, there are territories that have been fighting for hundreds of years against each other. And so Doña Marina did not have real allegiance with the Aztecs. And the native people give her to Cortes. And being Mayan of origin, she speaks the Mayan language. She has learned Aztec language and quickly picks up Spanish. And her ability to translate between those three languages is a huge, huge help to Cortes. She also, of course, knows the culture. She knows the warring strategies. She knows the territory. And it was said many times by Cortes that without her, he would not have been able to have conquered the land. A few other interesting sort of tidbits. She ends up mothering a son to Cortes and is very, very loyal to him, probably because she wants to benefit and wants to be powerful. And she can see quickly that by helping Cortes, her possibility of becoming high ranking and powerful is very, very possible. Another funny sort of sad side note, Cortes ends up giving her to one of his generals later on to be a wife for one of his generals. Very strange. This is a kind of interesting image. We see on the right side, we see Cortes and Doña Marina. And Cortes and Doña Marina are sort of reaching out, like, here, we're going to be helping you and trading you. And you see the cross on the right, and you see in the background, you see the temples dripping with blood, very realistic. And on the left side, you see Moctezuma in his warrior uniform and his guards, and you see someone holding his hand out, sort of pushing up against Cortes and against Doña Marina. And I think a lot of the natives understood the implications of what it meant for Cortes to come and trade and be willing negotiators versus, no, something is fishy about this. This isn't right, and you guys need to go away. But you can see between Doña Marina, her expression and her hands are sort of like, look, almost like a Mother Mary, Jesus's mother. You see Mary in a lot of expressions and physical gestures where her hands are held out like, look, you know what's coming. You should just sort of give in so that you don't die and follow what Cortes wants, because there will be extraordinary repercussions otherwise. Kind of an interesting image here. And this one is also in our textbook. And again, on the right side, you see Cortes and Doña Marina. And on the left side, you see Moctezuma and a few of his guards. And they're pointing their fingers at each other. I don't know about you, but when I point a finger like that, it's usually not a good thing. It's usually more of an angry, pokey, I don't really like what you're doing, I'm going to point my finger at you. Not that I point fingers at too many people, or ever, but if I were, I think it would be sort of angry. And it just goes to show that there is some tension here. There are different interpretations for what this all means. On the bottom, it's very likely that there were gifts or tribute being exchanged, and the direction of the animals they're all pointing towards Cortes. So it almost seems as though Moctezuma and his men are providing tribute to the new potential ruler. And surrounding Cortes is this huge sort of pedestal, and Moctezuma is sitting on a throne, as is Cortes, but Cortes and Doña Marina are on this like big platform. And on top looks like the hand of God and perhaps a priest providing prayers. And in some ways it looks like they're almost equal, but Cortes and Doña Marina almost appear a little bit larger, even though they are sitting. Their faces appear a little bit larger, and they perhaps seem a little bit more powerful and a little bit more confident. Moctezuma has 3 men behind him, but they're all sort of leaning backwards. It's kind of an interesting image. Okay, so now the Spanish strategies, and these are very, very important. divide and conquer. And this continues with the idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Aztecs, again, have so many enemies. There are 35 tribute states. Not all of them are providing tribute because they love Moctezuma and want to be part of the Aztec Empire. Some, like the Tlaxcala and several other groups, hate the Aztecs and have been fighting them nonstop for the last few hundred years. And with the help of Doña Marina, Cortes is able to understand that the Tlaxcala hate the Aztecs and want to fight them, and therefore is able to attempt and is successful at becoming friends with the Tlaxcala. Why would the Tlaxcala and other Aztec enemies join Cortes? Well, they're offered things that are quite enticing. Horses, steel swords, other firearms and other types of weaponry, in addition to other things. And the idea behind this is that they're going to win and become more powerful over their huge Aztec enemies who they hate and have hated for 300 plus years. And again, the Spanish strategies, unlike the Aztec strategies, warring strategies where they capture people for future sacrifice to the gods, the Spanish strategies are kill and get rid of as many people as possible. And we're going to start at the head. So time and time again, there are groups of leaders, of Aztec leaders, that just get completely mauled, beheaded, and limbs and arms removed, because when you don't have leadership, a chicken runs around without its head for a few minutes, but eventually it's going to fall, and it's probably going to fall very, very quickly. This image is called the Massacre of the Nobles, and a few European men came into a sort of religious ceremony. You see drums in the center, and these were Aztec people who did not have arms for the most part, especially not compared to the steel swords that the Spanish had, and the Spanish conquistadors blocked all the exits and pretty much killed everyone in the room. All of the leaders all of the nobility at the time in the room who were there praying and drumming and doing religious ceremonial stuff they were basically decapitated and had their limbs removed. And this is a very, very realistic image of what actually happened. And then there are some advantages that the Spanish had. They had steel swords. When you compare a steel sword to a wooden spear, there is no comparison. A steel sword can very quickly and easily chop through a wooden spear. And the Spanish had guns. Firearms make it possible to fight and kill from very far away. You don't have to have hand-to-hand combat against your enemies. You can hide behind or on top or next to something and shoot and kill, which is just an incredible advantage that the Spanish had. Additionally, they had horses, and these horses were not just means of carrying things and making people bigger. When you're on a horse, you're really, really tall, so you have great vantage points, perspectives, and more power because you have gravity on your side. Horses are also extremely intimidating for the Aztec people who have never seen these crazy wild beasts that are so big and so powerful. In the Americas, we don't have horses, we have llamas, and llamas are not useful for really much of anything aside from perhaps wool. And so these horses are intimidating in addition to everything else. And then diseases. And diseases might be the single most powerful weapon that the Spanish used. And of course, they did not really understand diseases at the time, but they brought diseases with them from the Eastern Hemisphere, from Europe, including in particular smallpox and yellow fever that had the biggest toll. And quickly, very, very quickly, within a few years, over 90% of the population died because the people in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, were never exposed to the microbes that these diseases had. And when you're not exposed, your body has no immunity. So when the Spanish come and get smallpox or yellow fever, they suffer for a few days or a few weeks and then they get better. And the Native American people in North and South America, they get exposed to these diseases, smallpox and yellow fever, and they do not survive for the most part. They die, and it's a harsh, quick, painful death. And this doesn't just have physical ramifications. It's not just that the population is weak and smaller. There are also psychological ramifications, because why are all of those white foreign people suffering from the same disease that we Native American Aztec people are suffering from, and they're not dying, and we are dying like flies? This is a really big problem because people start to question their gods. Are the gods angry with us? Maybe the Christian God is the right God. Maybe the Spanish and Cortes is the rightful leader. Maybe we should be bowing down to them. Maybe we should be ruled by them. And that questioning, that wavering, is such an extraordinary challenge for Moctezuma and for all the other leaders in the Aztec Empire when they are fighting someone who they question the possibility of him being a god or very strongly connected to God or the gods in their case. This is a really big problem. It's not just physical. We today know of diseases as being a physical challenge. You get a virus or something along those lines, and with the microbes you get sick, and then hopefully you can feel better with some medicine. Sometimes you have to like deal with it and suffer for a few days, and hopefully you'll get better. And we know it's a physical thing. We know it's science. We understand that. And at the time, the Aztecs did not understand that. Neither did the Europeans for the most part. Though after a while, they did see how when they were exposed to something like a blanket, and they would get smallpox, then they started using that as a war weapon, providing blankets and things like that that had been exposed to viruses and other diseases. They were giving those to Native Americans, both in North and South, and Mesoamerica as well. Okay, a few primary source documents. Okay, so these primary source documents that you have to read in order to answer this question, there are two of them, and they discuss when did Tenochtitlan fall. And there are two kind of interesting juxtaposing arguments. One is from Francisco de Aguilar, and it's called The Brief Record of the Conquest of New Spain, and it was written in 1560, so this is some 40 years after these events occurred, and this is a European Spanish perspective. The second is from Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, and this is from the Florentine Codex, and this was made in the mid-1500s, so close to the same time frame for both of these, but again, several decades after the actual events. And the second source is an Aztec person, someone who had converted to Christianity, someone who had been greatly influenced not just by the people who had conquered. The guy who wrote it, de Sahagún, was young at the time. He was perhaps a teenager and when the events took place. And when you're young and every leadership, your parents all get killed, and the new people come and take over, and you are taken under their wing and learn from them, you are probably greatly influenced by them. So keep that in mind. Why do these people have the perspectives that they have? And Francisco de Aguilar was a conquistador who worked for the Spanish, who was, one of the Spanish conquerors. And later he regretted what he had done, and that's part of the reason that he wrote about it. But those are kind of interesting things to think about. So, Okay, so the focus question again, how was the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés, along with a few hundred men, able to conquer the Aztec Empire of 25 million people? That's crazy to think about. So talk about at least 6 main reasons. There are many more than 6 main reasons. And again, look at the primary source documents, the images, the texts, the textbook, and look at lectures and PowerPoints to answer this question. Make sure you cite your sources. You need a thesis. You need evidence and you need analysis. You need to make an argument and then you need to prove it with specific examples and then explain the examples. There is an outline on how to create an outline on Blackboard, and we will discuss this more in class. Just a quick review. So there are 8 things listed here, and they all kind of blend together, but make sure you discuss at least 6 of them. I would say really it would be kind of important to talk about 8 of them. There are more reasons than this. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, a few more points that are important. The Great Dying. The Great Dying starts when Europeans end up conquering territory in the Americas. And the Great Dying is literally the dying of the Native American population. For the most part, it was because of diseases. There were at least 60 to 80 million people that did not have immunities. They had not been exposed to those microbes that came from Europe. And those old world diseases like smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, malaria, and yellow fever ended up decimating the population by at least 90% very, very quickly. Again, there is psychological and religious reasoning or proof. You are dying from these diseases because you do not believe in Jesus. You are not proper Christians. You need to convert, get rid of your old ways, your old gods, your old culture, your old customs, your old traditions, everything that you have known for the last thousands of years, and become Christian in order to survive. And that is a belief that was perpetuated throughout the Americas. And that is, I think, a really huge reason why so many people ended up converting to Christianity, at least to some degree. And just a quick look at North American populations. So in 1500, before Europeans arrived, the native populations are close to, let's see here, 8 million, maybe 7.5 million people in North America. This is not Mesoamerica or South America. This is not Aztec Empire or the Incans down in Peru. This is just North America. So Native Americans, around 7.5-ish million people. There are no Europeans or Africans, of course, in 1500. Within 300 years, the native population is below 1 million, and the European population is up to 5 million, and of course, Africans start being imported to work as slaves in slave plantations, and their population greatly increases to over 1 million. And this is because Europeans don't want to get their fingernails dirty. They are lazy and they are consider themselves gentlemen, and they aren't willing to do the hard work that it is to work land in order to farm and survive. And since all the native people have died, or almost all of them, many people have died, they import Africans. And we'll talk a lot more about this in the coming weeks. Here are some colonial empires in the Americas. You see the Spanish territories in yellow, the Portuguese territories in greenish, English territories up top in dark green, and the Dutch territories in purple in South America, and the French territories in the middle part of what is now the United States and Canada.